Welcome back to Rocker's Beer Review. Today we are doing an album ranking of the Polish progressive metal band Riverside. So, what are their best albums? Counting from 8th till 1st, here are Riverside's best albums. So, Riverside. If you don't know who Riverside are, they're basically one of the leading, I think, progressive rock stroke progressive metal bands in the world today. They were founded in 2001. That's 22 years ago, in Warsaw, in Poland. And for me, they're one of those sort of bands that have developed their sound like any good progressive rock band should be, from their sort of early, very more metallic metal, progressive metal in the lines of things like Pain of Salvation, Dream Theater in the sort of early 2000s, right up to a much more sort of experimental prog, sometimes a little bit more melodic, sometimes with a bit more pop and synth and 80s and all kinds of different sort of different types of musical genres all sort of thrown into the mix. But they are definitely one of the best progressive rock bands out there. So I'm really interested if anyone likes Riverside. Let me know in the comments. Let me know what your albums are, top albums by Riverside are. But let's kick off with album number in 8th position, and that is Anno Domini High Definition, or ADHD for short. So this album, I think, is in last place, but you know, with 8 albums, they're all good and they offer something different. But this is probably the one that I listen to the least. For me, it's their heaviest and they're probably the most proggiest of all their albums. I mean, a lot of people might really like that. It's only got 6 songs on it, and you know, most of the songs are pretty long. The shortest song is only just under 8 minutes, but most of them are long. There's lots more keyboards in it, even though it's really heavy and progressive. There's a lot more keyboards. There's more of a reminder of sort of like that sort of same sort of era of Tool and Dream Theater in the early 2000s. It's heavy, it's metal, it's progressive. It's almost as if they've done their heaviest progressive album. And for me, it just doesn't quite really work. I mean, I think the slower song, the slower song, which is pretty much one song called Left Out, is definitely my favourite by far. It's over 10 minutes long. It doesn't quite reach the highs of their sort of epics like The Curtain Falls or Dance for the Shadows. There's lots of like Hammond keyboard solos in there, which to me is a little bit too much. So I'm putting ADHD in number 8th position. In 7th position is their album Rapid Eye Movement. Now, Rapid Eye Movement, their 3rd album, it got a bit darker in terms of its tone compared to the first 2. It's less about the songs, not really as catchy, not really as you don't get into it as easy. It's not as sort of approachable as an album. There's lots more sort of distorted guitars. There are some great sort of musical soundscapes though as well. And again, I think with Riverside, and this is probably the same with probably all their albums, I find that the softer side is where they really shine, and the sort of slower ballad songs on this are definitely my favourite songs, like Through the Other Side and Embryonic. They're definitely the highlights of this album. So in 7th place is Rapid Eye Movement. In 6th position is Wasteland. Now, Wasteland was their sort of first album as a 3-piece, you know, after their former member, Peter Grudunsky, the guitar player, sadly died. And he was replaced in this album as a session musician by Maciej Mela. And he came in as the sort of main guitarist on the album. As you would expect from losing, you know, a founding band member, it's a little darker in tone. There is a sort of concept through it, all about basically a sort of end of the world, sort of, as I say, the wasteland, a sort of nuclear fallout, and the sort of, there's lots of very dark themes in this album. But again, some really beautiful melodies are coming out of it. The softer songs, again, I think stand out. Things like Guardian Angel and Lament, they're really, really powerful. And I think at this point their songwriting has got to that sort of stage where it's really hitting the points really. I think the songs flow better, and you really do feel within the whole of the album that loss of their sort of signature guitar player. But again, you know, it's probably lacking a little bit because there's not many real sort of standout lead guitar solos and playing on this album, and I think that is probably why it's not as high up in the ranking. So Wasteland number 6. In 5th position is the album Shrine of a New Generation Slaves. Now, if you take the first letters as an acronym for the title of this album, you get SONGS, songs, and that's really what you're getting with this album. It's much more song orientated, certainly compared with their sort of the previous albums before this, which were very much more long sort of progressive pieces, but this is all about sort of more snappier songs. You've got really sort of much more catchier song structures, and it's less about overplaying and more about, you know, getting to that point of a very good song. I mean, the opener, New Generation Slave, is a sort of heavy hard rocker, almost with a sort of 70s Deep Purple sort of feel to it. There's some great rhythm playing, some great Hammond and little gospel flurries in this. Celebrity Touch, which I think was their first single from this album, is again a much more 70s sort of hard rocker. There's still progressiveness in there, and certainly when you get to some of the ballads like We Got Used to Us, it's much darker and much more in the vein of some of the ballads off their first 2 albums. But it's not all about shorter sort of snappier songs. There are some really great progressive, longer, epic sort of songs on here as well, like the 8-minute sort of very atmospheric Deprived, or for me the standout track, which is the 12+ minutes Escalator Shrine, which reminds me a little bit of Marillion in their sort of .com era. So I think this is a very good album, and I think this is probably, if you're just getting into Riverside for the first time, it's a really good starting point because it's all about the songs. So I'm putting in 5th position Shrine of New Generation Slaves. In 4th position is their latest album, Identity. Now, Identity, obviously their session guitarist has now joined as a full-time member of the band, and his guitar play is much more pronounced in this album. But it's a definite change and a more progression from Riverside's sound. We've getting almost like a much more 80s sort of synth sound in the whole of this album. So in some instances, they sound like a much heavier, progressive version of Aha, especially in the synth-led opener, Friend or Foe. There's also a fair slab of 80s Rush in there. I think, you know, because Maciej, I'm not quite sure how to pronounce his name. I think it's Maciej Mela, Maciej. I'm not quite sure how you pronounce that. I'm not very good at Polish pronunciations. But he's a permanent member. He sort of comes across as a more sort of subtle Alex Lifeson in terms of his guitar playing. Quite different than the founder, Peter. He who is much more of a sort of Gilmour sort of type of player. So as I said, there's a lot of synth heavy sort of songs in here, but there's also a little bit of a throwback to their sort of earlier albums, certainly on the bass-led Landmine Blast, and certainly on Big Tech Brother, which is as close as Duda, the lead singer, has really come to that sort of death metal growl that he used to use quite a bit in those first 2 albums. So I'm putting Identity in 4th position. What I would say is my standout track from this album is definitely got to be the 13-minute The Place Where I Belong. Although it's 13 minutes, it's not really, I wouldn't really call it an epic as such. It's more of a multi-part, overly long ballad, but it's a really great, there's lots of acoustic guitars, some great solos in this song as well, both on keyboards and guitar. It's a really great track. So that's number 4 in my list. Now we hit number 3. So number 3 is the album Love, Fear and the Time Machine. So Love, Fear and the Time Machine, I think it's a great follow-up really to the Shrine of New Generation, where it's all about, again, all about the songs. The theme, though, is much more melodic than than anything they'd really done before. It's sort of quite a dreamy sort of soundscape across the sort of 60+ minutes. Quite a long album. It's quite melancholy as well. It's all about loss and nostalgia and those sort of things as well. But the songs are beautifully put together, and I think, again, they've taken those great songwriting sort of skills from the previous album to make this a really good album. A lot of the technical wizardry, I think, again, he's not back, but the melodies really sing because of that. And you get slight heaviness in parts, especially in the epic Towards the Blue Horizon, Discard the Fear, and #Addicted. But it's definitely their most laid-back album. Some of their softer compositions, which I'm a massive fan of. Really, I think it makes this album much stronger for me. Key tracks are the already mentioned 8 minutes beyond Beyond the Blue Horizon, but also the very poignant Caterpillar and the Barbed Wire, and my favourite track, the very sort of nostalgic Time Travelers, with some really incredible melodies. So I'm putting Love, Fear and the Time Machine as my third choice. In second place is Out of Myself. So, second place, runner-up for the top spot, is their debut album, Out of Myself. Again, the guitaring really stood out when I first heard this album. I heard it pretty much soon after it came out, and I'd never heard of them before. I just sort of stumbled upon them. I think that, the guitar playing very much in that sort of David Gilmour ink, and obviously Marisa Duda's voice, really is a great... He's got a really unique voice. There is a little bit of that Polish accent coming in, but really, I don't think there's anyone else that sounds quite like him. Again, I mentioned Aha in some of the other albums. I think his voice is is a heavier, harder edge version of Morten Harket, really, from Aha. And I think, everyone knows what great voice he's got. So this album, there's so much different variation with that. You've got the sort of slower ballads, but you've also got really hard and quite sort of heavy metal, very progressive metal, in fact. As I said, he uses some death metal growls on some of the songs. But the soft ballads like I Believe and In Two Minds, really incredible songs. Then you've got something like Loose Heart, which goes from a sort of slow ballad to something really heavy and very sort of, there's lots of screaming and shouting by the singer here. And it reminded me of another band that I was getting into at the time, and I mentioned at the front of this video, Pain of Salvation, another big band that I'm a big fan of. And it had that sort of, if it was any band that was similar, this was the band that I thought they sounded very similar to on this album. And this album is 20 years old, but even now it still sounds great. It still sounds fresh, and it still sounds current. It's one of those albums that really has stood the test of time. I think the only downsides really are the sort of the Same River and the sort of all the Reality Dream instrumentals. Yeah, they break up the album and give it a little bit more colour and texture, but they don't really do much for me. I'm not really a massive fan of sort of progressive metal instrumentals. Certainly for me, some of the standout traits are the heaviness of the title track and the epic The Curtain Falls. Really show off the talents of all the band members here. So really great debut, but it's in number 2 position. And in first position is their second album, Second Life Syndrome. Yep. Second Life Syndrome is my favourite album by them. It released in 2005. It took everything of that debut and really sort of made everything better, just sort of added to the sort of songs. It's similar in style. It's heavier in places with tracks like Voltiforce, Artificial Smile, and also softer in places like tracks like Conceiving You and I Turned You Down. There are 2 10-minute plus epics, the excellent title track, and one of my favourite songs, Dance with the Shadows. And it's funny though with this album, as much as it's good, it's very paired to their debut album. You could almost take tracks from this album and the debut and put them side by side. So you got After, or the beginning, the first sort of song on this album. It's a cinematic sort of soundscape track similar to The Same River. Vaulty Force and Artificial Smile have a similar sort of metal sound to Out of Myself. Conceiving You and I Turned You Down, they have a slightly similar melodic sort of feel to I Believe and In Two Minds. And Dancing in the Shadows is almost like a better follow-up to this, The Curtain Falls. So both albums also have the similar sort of tracks before on this album and OK on the debut that end the albums, and again they're quite similar as well. So it's almost like a sort of second part, but it does take that first album and make the songwriting is stronger. Every song that's similar to in style to that first album is better, and that makes it a better album. And that's really why I think it's the #1 album. I mean, for me, it's one of those albums that I don't think Riverside will ever sound like this again. It's a snapshot on how they were at the time, but for me it's got to go down as one of the best progressive metal albums of the 21st century. I mean, that's a big statement to make, but I stand by it. I'm interested to know what other people think. Hopefully if you're watching this, you're a fan of Riverside, and maybe you agree with me. I mean, I still think they're underrated. They're not known in sort of rock and metal circles as much, but if you're into prog rock and prog metal, you will find a lot of fans of them, and they are still a very good band. Other two EPs that they've released, Voices in My Head and Memories in My Head. They're both sort of excellent, very melodic, and really great little introductions to Riverside. I haven't included them in my ranking, but they would appear quite high because they're very good. But they're only like 3, 4, 5 songs on each of those. So, but definitely worth checking out those 2 EPs. So, hope you enjoyed my ranking of the progressive metal band Riverside. Are they progressive metal or are they progressive rock? Certainly, I think after their recent albums, they more sort of veer onto the side of prog rock than prog metal, but they've still got those metallic elements in them. And again, they're still a really incredible band, and they're one of the leading progressive metal rock bands out there today. But let me know in the comments what you think of my ranking. Let me know what you think of Riverside. What other bands do you think? There was a bit of an explosion of Polish prog rock, prog metal bands, but Riverside really have left all the others behind, and they're still the leading light there, I think, out of Poland. So until the next one, you know what you're going to do. Please like and subscribe if you're not a subscriber. Why are you not a subscriber? We do lots of rock and metal rankings, little videos, little articles and stuff like that about the music. So please subscribe if you're not already a subscriber. Of course, we do a lot of beer reviews as well for those who like their craft beer. And yeah, I'm whittling on enough. I've got to stop now, and I'm going to go back and listen to some decent prog rock. So listen to good prog rock and keep on rocking.